Next. Behind this reunion selfie lies an untold story of time, fame, loss, and the lasting legacy of The Wire, 2002. There are stories that entertain us for a season, and then there are stories that wait for us until life has aged us enough to understand them. The Wire is one of those stories. It does not arrive like a celebration. It arrives like a reckoning. Quiet, cold, patient, like a city watching you from across the street, already knowing things you have not learned yet. And maybe that is why it fits so perfectly with the image of meeting yourself across time. The younger self still thinks the world is divided clearly: good people, bad people, justice, failure, winners, losers. The older self knows better. The older self knows systems swallow innocence, institutions reward compromise, and survival often looks nothing like victory. That is The Wire. Not just a crime show, not just a police drama, but a long, piercing meditation on what a city does to the people trapped inside it, and what time does to the souls trying to remain human there. The series was created by David Simon for HBO, premiered on June 2, 2002, ended on March 9, 2008, and ran for 5 seasons and 60 episodes. Each season widened the lens, moving from the drug trade to the docks, to City Hall, to schools, to the newsroom, until the whole portrait became less about crime than about the anatomy of an American city. What made The Wire different from almost everything around it was not simply realism. It was structure, patience, refusal. It refused easy heroes. It refused easy villains. It refused to flatter the audience. And it refused to pretend that individual goodness could easily defeat institutional decay. When it first aired, it was admired, but not embraced on the scale it deserved. Its ratings were modest. Its awards attention was shockingly thin. The Television Academy gave it only 2 Emmy nominations, both for writing, in 2005 and 2008, and it won neither. For a show now routinely treated as one of television's greatest achievements, that fact still feels almost surreal. And yet, just like the greatest stories often do, The Wire outlived the moment that underappreciated it. Over time, critics, writers, filmmakers, actors, and viewers kept returning to it. Not because it was comforting, not because it was flashy, but because it told the truth with a rare kind of moral seriousness. Today, it is widely regarded as one of the greatest television series ever made. Rolling Stone's all-time television list placed it near the very top. TV Guide has ranked it among the best series ever, and newer all-time lists still continue to treat it as essential viewing. Even when lists disagree over whether The Sopranos, Breaking Bad, or another series deserves the #1 spot, The Wire is almost always in the final argument. That is because The Wire does not simply tell a story. It builds a world. And then it asks whether anyone inside that world can remain whole. Jimmy McNulty is brilliant and self-destructive. Stringer Bell is disciplined and doomed. Omar Little is a myth walking in daylight. Bubbles is pain, endurance, and grace in human form. Kima Greggs, Cedric Daniels, Bunk Moreland, Avon Barksdale, Marlo Stanfield, Wallace D'Angelo, none of them are there just to entertain. They are there to reveal something. About ambition. About compromise. About class. About race. About power. About the lies institutions tell in order to keep functioning. And because the show is so obsessed with time, how people get worn down, how ideals corrode, how children inherit broken systems, it fits almost perfectly with the visual idea of a younger self standing beside an older self. Imagine young McNulty taking a selfie with present-day Dominic West. The same eyes, but less recklessness. The same intelligence, but maybe more understanding of damage. Imagine young Stringer Bell beside Idris Elba now, one version still trying to build an empire inside a rigged world, the other carrying the weight of everything that role began. Imagine Wallace beside the older Michael B. Jordan, a boy whose future felt stolen, standing beside a man who went on to become one of the defining stars of his generation. That is where the emotion lives in this concept. Not just in aging faces, but in the gap between innocence and consequence, between potential and survival. And when we look at the cast now, that feeling becomes even stronger. Dominic West, the face of Jimmy McNulty, is still very much active. After The Wire, he moved through major television and film work, including The Affair and The Crown, and remains professionally active today. He is one of the clearest examples of how The Wire launched people into long second and third acts, rather than freezing them in one iconic role. Wendell Pierce, who gave Bunk Moreland his humor, gravity, and warmth, is also still active and working steadily. Recent credits listed by IMDb include Elsbeth through 2026, and film work including Superman and the upcoming Jack Ryan feature. He remains one of those rare performers whose presence instantly makes a scene feel lived in and real. Sonia Sohn, unforgettable as Kima Greggs, remains active too, though her career has also included directing and activism. Recent credits tied to Will Trent in 2025 show that she has not disappeared from screen work at all. She has simply evolved beyond a single lane. Wood Harris, who played Avon Barksdale with such calm authority, continues acting as well. IMDb lists him in Forever and One Battle After Another in 2025, proof that some actors do not fade so much as deepen. Idris Elba, whose Stringer Bell became one of the defining television performances of the century, remains a major force on screen even while talking openly about wanting to direct more. In late 2025, he said he hopes to eventually transition fully into directing, but he also confirmed continued acting work, including another Luther film. That makes him less a case of stepping away than of expanding into a new chapter. Andre Royo, who played Bubbles with extraordinary tenderness and truth, remains active as an actor, producer, and writer. The role still defines him for many viewers, but his career did not end there. Aidan Gillen, who played Tommy Carcetti, also remains active, with recent and upcoming screen credits listed for 2025, 2026, and beyond. And then there is Michael B. Jordan. On The Wire, he was Wallace, young, vulnerable, unforgettable. A child of the system, crushed before he ever had the chance to outgrow it. But outside the show, Jordan's career became one of the most extraordinary success stories in modern Hollywood. He went from The Wire to Fruitvale Station, Creed, Black Panther, and major 2025 work that kept him firmly at the center of film culture. If ever there were an image that captures your young self meets older self concept, Wallace standing beside present-day Michael B. Jordan might be one of the most powerful in all of television memory. So when people ask who from The Wire is still active, the answer is not small. Many of them are. And that matters, because The Wire was a show about endurance. About human beings trying to remain themselves inside structures designed to flatten them. To see so many of its actors still working, still creating, still carrying those roles with them, feels strangely in tune with the show's deepest rhythms. But not everyone made it to this present chapter. And this is where the story becomes heavier. Because The Wire, like the city it portrayed, now carries ghosts. The most painful of them for many viewers is Michael K. Williams, who played Omar Little. Williams died on September 6, 2021, at age 54. Omar was one of the greatest characters television has ever produced. Charismatic, dangerous, wounded, funny, unpredictable, and somehow deeply principled inside a brutal moral landscape. Williams gave him mythic stature without ever losing the humanity underneath. His death was not just the loss of a beloved actor. It felt like the loss of a piece of television's conscience. Then came Lance Reddick, who played Cedric Daniels with such discipline, intelligence, and quiet steel. Reddick died in March 2023 at age 60. He had built a career of precision and authority, but for many viewers, Daniels remains one of his purest performances, a man trying to hold dignity inside corrupt machinery. Robert F. Chu, who played Proposition Joe, died in 2013 at age 52. In a series full of noise and ego, Prop Joe was something else, measured, sly, and almost old world in his patience. Chu was also deeply tied to the Baltimore arts community, which makes his loss feel connected not just to the show but to the city that shaped it. Reggie Cathy, remembered by many Wire fans for his appearances in the show and by a wider audience for later works such as House of Cards, died in 2018 at age 59. His voice alone could command a scene. His presence always seemed older than fashion and deeper than performance. And in the more recent stretch of time, the losses continued. Isaiah Whitlock Jr., beloved by Wire fans as Clay Davis, died in late 2025 at age 71 after a short illness, according to the Associated Press. Not long before that, James Ransone, remembered from Season 2 as Ziggy Sobotka, also died in 2025. Their passings are a painful reminder that the world of The Wire is no longer just a living ensemble. It is becoming memory. And that changes the emotional texture of any reunion concept. Because now, when we imagine these characters meeting their older selves, some of those meetings can only happen through cinema, editing, remembrance, and grief. Omar cannot grow old on our screens anymore. Daniels cannot step back into the frame. Prop Joe cannot lean in with one more quiet smile. Clay Davis cannot stretch out one more unforgettable line. Time has taken them. Which is exactly why The Wire feels even more powerful now than it did when it was new. Because the show always understood something many stories avoid. That institutions go on, systems renew themselves, streets keep breathing, newspapers keep printing, politics keeps moving, children keep growing up inside broken conditions. But individual human lives are fragile, finite, interruptible, gone much faster than the machine around them. That truth sits underneath every season. Season 1 says the drug war is not a war anyone intends to end. Season 2 says labor can decay while the people tied to it are expected to disappear quietly. Season 3 says reform collides with politics. Season 4 says children are drafted into structures they did not build. Season 5 says even the stories we tell about reality are vulnerable to corruption. And none of those ideas have aged out. If anything, they have become sharper. That is one reason The Wire remains so revered. It was not merely ahead of its time. It was diagnosing patterns that never stopped repeating. So then we reach the hardest question. Has any show surpassed The Wire? The honest answer is, it depends on what surpassed means. If you mean popularity in the moment, of course many shows did. If you mean awards recognition, absolutely. The Wire barely received Emmy attention at all. If you mean larger mainstream cultural takeover, then yes, other shows became bigger phenomena, louder events, more immediate obsessions. But if you mean depth of social vision, if you mean the ability to portray not just characters, but systems, if you mean television that feels less like entertainment and more like literature, sociology, tragedy, and civic testimony all at once, then The Wire becomes very difficult to surpass. That is why the conversation so often narrows to a few giants. The Sopranos, The Wire, Breaking Bad, maybe Mad Men. Maybe a few others, depending on taste. Some lists put The Sopranos first and The Wire second. Some critics argue The Wire is the greatest because of its scope and its moral architecture. Others prefer the psychological intimacy of The Sopranos or the propulsion of Breaking Bad. But the important thing is this: The Wire has never left the top tier. Decades after its premiere, it is still a reference point for what television can be when it refuses simplification. And maybe that is because The Wire does not give us the fantasy of escape. It gives us recognition. It says, "This is how power works. This is how language gets bent. This is how institutions protect themselves. This is how children inherit damage. This is how decent people compromise. This is how ambition curdles. This is how survival reshapes morality." That is not comforting, but it is clarifying. And clarity can be its own form of mercy. Which brings us back to your visual concept: young self, old self, one frame. Because The Wire is, in its own way, a giant portrait of that exact distance. The younger self still believes talent is enough. The older self knows systems matter more than talent. The younger self thinks corruption is exceptional. The older self realizes corruption is often procedural. The younger self believes every tragedy has a single villain. The older self understands tragedy is often distributed across offices, incentives, paperwork, budgets, habits, elections, headlines, and silence. To stand beside your younger self in the world of The Wire is to see how much of reality you had not yet learned to name. And yet the series is not hopeless. That is important. Bleak, yes. Brutal, often. But not empty. Because inside all that machinery, The Wire still leaves room for human grace. For Bubbles trying, one day at a time, to reclaim a life. For Daniels trying to preserve integrity. For Bunk trying to remember what the job was supposed to mean. For teachers who still care. For kids who still dream. For tiny acts of loyalty, humor, decency, and witness. That is the core value of The Wire. Not optimism. Not naive hope. But moral wakefulness. The courage to see the world as it is. Without lying about it. Without decorating it. And without surrendering every part of yourself to its ugliness. That is why the show lasts. That is why it grows heavier, not lighter with age. That is why a 20-year-old may admire it. But a 40-year-old, a 50-year-old, a 60-year-old may feel it in the bones. Because once time has taken a few illusions from you, The Wire stops feeling like fiction. It starts feeling like recognition. So no, maybe there is no universal answer to whether another show has surpassed it. Television is too large, taste is too personal, and greatness is too complicated for that. But there are only a handful of series that still feel this alive, this studied, this argued over, this necessary, decades later. And The Wire is unquestionably one of them. Not because it won the most. Not because it pleased the widest audience at first. Not because it offered easy catharsis. But because it trusted us to face complexity. Because it believed the truth was dramatic enough. Because it understood that the real battle is rarely between heroes and villains. It is between human beings. And the systems that slowly teach them what they are allowed to become. And that is why The Wire belongs in a Selfie with Time series. Because in the end, that image is not only about age. It is about knowledge. It is about looking at who you were. Before the city. Before the compromise. Before the losses. Before the lessons. And then looking at who time turned you into. Somewhere between those two faces lies the entire story. And The Wire has always known that. It knew that every institution leaves a mark. That every season of life rewrites the self. That every street teaches a language. That every survival carries a cost. So when we meet The Wire again now, years later, we are not just revisiting an old show. We are seeing how much of it came true. How much of it stayed true. And how much of ourselves had to age before we could fully understand what it was saying. That is why it endures. That is why it still hurts. That is why it still matters. And that is why, even now, it remains one of the few television works that does not simply ask to be remembered. It asks to be reckoned with. If your younger self could watch The Wire with you today, which character or moment do you think would hit you the hardest, and why? Do you believe The Wire is still the most honest television series ever made? Or has another show truly surpassed it over time? Which cast reunion between the younger and older versions would move you the most? McNulty, Stringer Bell, Omar, Bubbles, or Wallace?